Okay, good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to this first Irish Studies seminar from Queen's University Belfast of this academic year, 2023-24. My name is Peter Gray. I'm the director of the Institute. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker. And I know there's a lot of people joining us online through Teams as well, so you're very welcome wherever you are. I hope you can hear me and can hear us. I have unmuted the mic, so shout out if you can't hear us online. We'll try to fix that. Obviously, people in the room can hear us, so that's not a problem. Right? Thank you, particularly to the MA students who are joining us for the first time. You're very, very welcome to the seminar series. Okay, so our speaker today is Professor Anna Johnston, who is Professor of English Literature in the School of Communications and the Arts at the University of Queensland. So she's come a long way to speak to us today, not just to speak to us. She's been doing other events and a bit of research as well on this trip to Ireland. So Anna has published very widely on the field of colonial and post-colonial studies, focusing on literary and cultural history. And her new monograph, The Antipodean Laboratory, Making Colonial Knowledge, 1770 to 1870, will be published in October 2023 by Cambridge University Press. And Anna's going to speak to us today about her current research project, which has a very strong Ulster and Irish dimension to it. Songs of an Exile, Sentiment and Violence in Eliza Hamilton Dunlop's Irish and Australian Elegies, 1838 to 1863. Anna.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks for accommodating an Australian visitor, and to Moira for connecting us up. I have been at a conference in Dublin the end of last week, so it's a great pleasure to come up and give a very different paper than what I was giving there, and one that I really feel I hope you enjoy, and I hope you've got some ideas for me to help the latter part of the paper, where I'm still trying to work out a few intrigues and mysteries of this writer. I do feel in many ways that I'm slightly bringing coals to Newcastle in talking about the Northern Ireland component of this writing, but for that reason, I really value your input, and it's really why I wanted to come and give this paper here, because the Australian material is familiar to me, and I've been doing my best from afar to understand the Northern Ireland context. For that reason, this paper is organised not chronologically, which might upset the historians amongst you, but I'm going to work from what I know well and then take you back in history to what I'm still working through. In scrawled pencil on the nearest scrap of paper, Eliza Hamilton Dunlop jotted down the first two stanzas of a poem you can just see here. It began, "Oh, your eyes have the twin stars light, Marie." On the reverse of the paper is a convict pass. You can see that on the right-hand side. "Permit George Nimbers to pass to Mr. John Medhurst and with him to remain for harvest work." Signed by David Dunlop, police magistrate in December 1840. In the papers held in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, the draft stanzas are less visible than the convict pass in several ways: faint pencil versus official ink, and a modern archival note about the convict pass, but not the verses on the other side. Yet they had a rich afterlife. A full three-stanza version of the poem Songs of Exile No. 5, The Irish Mother, was published in the Australian newspaper in January 1839. Far away, here in Belfast, The Irish Mother was read by the Irish nationalist and journalist Charles Gavin Duffy, who included in his highly popular anthology The Ballad Poetry of Ireland, a study of what he called Anglo-Irish ballads, the production of educated men with English tongues but Irish hearts. It's just a couple above the title there, renamed. It remained in this anthology remained in print throughout the 19th century in over 40 editions. Even in 1866, Duffy continued to praise the touching little ballad for its freshness and grace. It became more meaningful for him across time because of his extensive travels and long public service in the Australian colonies between 1855 and 1880. Yet he remained unsure of the identity of the author of the poem he had retitled The Emigrant Mother, perhaps thinking of William Wordsworth's 1807 poem of the same title. The original author, Eliza Hamilton Dunlop, had herself been an immigrant mother in 1838, albeit a much more privileged one than the subject of her sentimental poem. 1838 was a tumultuous year for any family to arrive in Sydney. Eliza, her husband David, and their 4 children arrived just days after the newly appointed Lieutenant Governor Sir George Gipps. One of Gipps' first acts was to table the House of Commons 1837 report from the Select Committee on Aborigines in the British Settlements, which has aptly been described by Amanda Nettleback as the most famous statement on the interests of Indigenous peoples whose lands came within the British Empire's vast territorial claims. Gipps was about to attempt a radically new and contentious legal framework of protection of and jurisdiction over First Nations people. Eliza's husband, David, was one of the first people appointed to the joint roles of salaried police magistrate and Aboriginal protector. This role was part of a new Whiggish regime that was strongly resisted by powerful pastoralists who swiftly assessed all newcomers on party grounds, political ideology and adherence. Conditions on the northern colonial frontier in 1838 also were highly volatile, and intervention of some kind was urgently needed. Gipps and the Dunlops arrived in Sydney only weeks after the January massacre at Waterloo Creek. By June, rumours began to filter through official channels of another massacre of about 30 Indigenous people at Myall Creek, 200 kilometres to the east. In December 1838, Eliza Hamilton Dunlop published her best-known poem, The Aboriginal Mother, in the Australian newspaper, drawing on the law reports of the Myall Creek massacre trials in the colonial newspapers. Dunlop's poem was sympathetic to Indigenous survivors and highly critical of settler violence. I'll show you the full poem a bit later. It was published only 5 days before 7 convict stockmen and shepherds were hanged for their involvement in the massacre, almost the only time this happened in Australian colonial history. And so it was this poem that shaped the Dunlop family's entry to colonial society and profoundly influenced their public standing. Now, I've been working with Dunlop's literary archive since I rediscovered the breadth of her published Australian poetry, thanks to the National Library of Australia's massive digitisation of colonial newspapers. I've found that there were nearly 100 poems she published between 1838 and 1873. And in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, I also found a previously unknown manuscript of juvenile poems written in Ireland that's helping me map Dunlop's literary contribution across the breadth of her life. Again, I'll talk about this a bit later. In 2021, I published the first scholarly book dedicated to Dunlop's Australian poetry. With my dear and recently departed colleague, Professor Elizabeth Webby from the University of Sydney, I commissioned a range of literary scholars, historians and linguists from Australia and the US to examine Dunlop's contribution to Australian cultural history. In the first part of my paper today, I'd like to introduce you to Eliza Hamilton Dunlop's Australian writing from 1838. Then I'd like to explore how a use of one particular poetic form, the elegy, constantly linked Ireland and Australia, as well as other sites in her literary imagination. And finally, I want to share with you my current understanding of the complex Irish history that Dunlop brought with her to Australia, and ask your advice on how best to account for some of the as yet unexplained aspects of the life and writing of this fascinating poet of empire. Literature, governmentality and social standing were interlinked aspects by which Eliza and her husband David became colonial. Civil, military and literary circles connected the settler elite who presided over the majority convict population and the increasingly displaced Indigenous peoples. Participating in colonial literature and culture to some extent distinguished free colonists from convict emancipists and ensured that questions of governance and culture were entwined. Scandals regularly rocked colonial society, with gossip and inside knowledge traded across colonies and across empire. The Dunlop family brought with them some unconventional ideas and personal histories. There was plenty to gossip about. as well as letters and introductions to the government and members of the Anglo-Irish elite that shaped their relationships in the Australian colonies. Now, as part of a new scholarly resurgence of interest in the light verse that littered journals, literary albums, and newspapers in the early 19th century, I've been thinking about how Dunlop's use of the literary form of elegy reveals the cultural and emotional work that could be done by light verse. Angela Layton describes elegy as an unusual literary form that takes its name from what it's about rather than any conventional structure. It's often moral and emotional writing rather than highbrow literary work, and its affective register connects both the elegist and readers in grieving individual and collective losses. Dunlop's poetic elegies mourned Anglo-Irish family members, colonial elites, murdered First Nations communities, and exiled colonial resistance leaders. In New South Wales, Dunlop used the form to commemorate what she had left behind and to forge literary and emotional bonds with new communities. Even if the writing is not always sophisticated, the cultural politics of it are nuanced and often surprising. Dunlop's mobile life and complex family connections show us how webs of empire enabled and inspired poets, including women whose writing was underpinned by affect, curiosity, and imaginative affiliation with others. Now, we know well that sentimental modes provided poets with many opportunities to reflect on and critique British imperial expansion across the long 19th century. As Jason Rudy notes, colonial poets looked back nostalgically to their imaginary homeland. They often remade conventional poetic forms to create new colonial visions. But these also required the often violent dislocation of others and the brutal transformation of natural landscapes. Dunlop's Australian poetry was highly innovative in its use of Indigenous language and cultural knowledge, as well as its preparedness to write about settler violence and the dispossession of First Nations people. Connecting Dunlop's literary and family history back to Northern Ireland shows how she used a sentimental poetic discourse, popular with women publishing in the new periodicals and literary albums, to grapple with what the literary critic Nathan Hensley calls the uncanny persistence of violence in a globalised liberal society. Hensley notes that the years between 1837 and 1901 were characterised not just by social progress, widening democracy, or mechanised enlightenment, but also by ongoing war and extrajudicial violence, such as the Indian Mutiny, and we could add the Mile Creek Massacre. He tracks a handful of 19th century poets, novelists, and political theorists who, he argues, stretched the boundaries of their thinking to account for the seeming paradox by which a project of universal modernisation could unfold hand in hand with generalised killings. Dunlop's poems link Northern Ireland and New South Wales, amongst other locations, in these feminised sentimental modes that reveal the widespread and unsettling evidence of that violence. Regina Gagne suggests that mapping cultural exchanges between Victorians and all the cultures with which they came in contact can reveal what she calls literatures of liberalisation. Dunlop's use of elegy was in some aspects conventional. The subjects of her writing included notable members of the community, and through these, a personal sketch of colonial society emerges. As Elizabeth Webby suggests, to study the literature written in Australia before 1850 is mostly to study poetry, although that is too grand a title, she says, for most of the jingles, impromptus, and other poetic effusions offered to the public. Verse predominated, and minor contributors jostled alongside the few major poets such as Charles Harper. But although the literary community was small, debates about aesthetics and an emerging colonial literature were vociferous. Elegies to the dead and laments for war and suffering were pretty standard parts of the global poetic repertoire. Abolitionist verse, too, had built an appetite for what's known as crying mother poems, which mobilised transatlantic sympathy for non-white mothers who lamented their suffering, including the loss of children under slavery. Dunlop's poem, The Aboriginal Mother, has been situated in this tradition by some critics, yet it posed a distinct challenge to colonial literary culture. The Aboriginal Mother featured a topic that was highly charged because of the proximity of the violence and the contentious local prosecution and hanging of the murderers. Massacres were deemed inappropriate subjects for colonial verse, especially by women. And colonial critics responded vigorously. Pro pudor, for shame, funded the critic James Rennie. Dunlop was savage for her presumption in writing the poem, while commentators in the newspapers denigrated Aboriginal women using a range of racially based slurs. The Romantic scholar Duncan Wu considers the critical attack on Dunlop unprecedented, even within the period's poor reception of women poets. The colonial newspapers vigorously debated the ethics of colonialism during this period, and they too saw literary endeavours as foundational to settler society. Sorry, I should have pulled the poem up for you here. You can see here it's quite explicit. In Australia, I wouldn't ever read this poem out loud, and I would be warning Indigenous members of the audience that there is distressing content. She imagines an Aboriginal mother who has survived the Mile Creek but has lost her husband and her firstborn child. There's a baby that survives, and the poem is structured around this imagined narrator speaking to her baby about the loss of their father and brother, but also importantly, the loss of culture. And you can see in some of the sections that I've highlighted here how explicit she was about settler violence being the cause of the fairly horrifying scene that she's depicting. I can bring that back up again later. Dunlop's thoughts during this turbulent time were often on the country, family and friends she'd left behind in Ireland. What thoughts within this bosom swell, what tears an exile's eyes are filling, she wrote. Songs of an Exile comprised a series of 10 poems published between 1838 when she arrived and 1840. These included autobiographical verses, but also featured poetic personae, such as the speakers of the paired poems, The Aboriginal Mother, number 4, and The Irish Mother, number 5. Oh, sorry, I left the stories in there as well because they're an intriguing little aside. Both of those two poems, the mother poems, used the elegiac mode in the form of a passionate address to a beloved absent child. Though the Irish mother looks back at a child distanced by emigration rather than colonial massacre. You can see one of the stanzas there. Women, family, and affective bonds were key themes in this series that would have resonated with readers from many 19th century immigrant families. But Dunlop's verse also reveals a politicised use of the elegiac mode. She joined together sentiment and social issues, a common feature of women's poetry of the time, under the influence of writers like Felicia Hemans. Jason Rudy argues that close attention to Dunlop's verse reveals the complex interplay between emigration and readership. Dunlop's Songs of an Exile number 3 eulogises 2 young brothers from her husband David's Northern Irish family who died in Mississippi within days of each other. Rudy shows how this poem was first published in Belfast in 1837, then revised by Dunlop for its 1838 Australian publication, and then she republished it back in the mid-1840s. Small changes in pronouns in the different versions of this poem helped Dunlop associate with the colonial community, aligning herself and her Sydney readers with the Irish brothers who, living on foreign soil, lack both a true home and the happiness afforded by friendship. And across this series of exile poems, Dunlop created imaginative and affective links between diasporic immigrants and dispossessed Indigenous peoples in ways that were politically radical, even if we might now question some of their universalising ideologies. Sentiment and political ideas then travel together in Dunlop's Elegies. Recent scholarship about the Victorian poetess tradition has emphasised how these writers expressed public concerns as if they were private ones. In Dunlop's writing, we see private sentiments being shaped for public and political ends. Dunlop certainly shares a number of the key characteristics of the poetess as Marjorie Stone defines her. Generically female, yet also normatively white. Private, yes, performative and often political. Lyrical, yet highly rhetorical. a vessel of nationalist ideologies, yet also an agent with transnational mobility. In the settler colonies of Ireland and Australia, of course, national sentiment contained a strong element of anti-imperialism as colonial societies tested ideas about political and cultural independence. Dunlop inscribed the memory of Irish revolutionary history in her mourning of a homeland to which she never returned. And in doing so, she infused her Australian poems, I suggest, with a rich transcultural history of political dissent, which sat behind a sentimental and socially acceptable veneer of feminised sentimental verse. For Dunlop, Elegies could engage in political as well as social and moral work. She had a back history on this, and this is where I start to welcome your input later on. In 1814, she had planned a volume of poetry titled Altoniana, featuring what was called in the advertisement historical poems, principally confined to the authentic history of Ulster in the days of feudal domination. It remained unpublished and unfindable so far. Antiquarian and political themes became unpalatable in the aftermath of the 1798 Irish Rebellion. In 1834, Maria Edgeworth declared it impossible to draw Ireland as she is now in a book of fiction. Realities are too strong, party passions too violent to bear or see or care to look at their faces in the looking glass. Drup Learson suggests that it was not until the 1840s that Irish writers began to reconfigure the events of 1798 for local literary audiences, using romantic themes to reconfigure, he says, the moral significance of 1798 and its insurgents, first in a tragic and subsequently in a heroic light. What fascinates me is that Dunlop's writing about 1798 emerged at the same time, halfway around the globe, in colonial Australian papers. Dunlop's The Irish Volunteers was published in 1843 and extolled the virtues of what she called a 150,000 strong, self-constituted, self-supported and effectively disciplined military body raised in 1780. The volunteers were involved in the resistance to English rule. This is where I'm bringing Coles, the Newcastle, of course, organising and mobilising a provincial political culture in Ian McBride's terms. And her poem extols their names in a roll call, as you can see. The names of Caulfield, Grattan, Flood, proud pillars of the past have stood, enshrined by Erin's gratitude, embalmed by Erin's tears, thus loved like theirs, a name we prize, engirt by fame's triumphal dyes, our ruling star of southern skies and Irish volunteers. Now, David Dunlop, Eliza's second husband, was part of a Presbyterian Church of Scotland family. His great-great-grandfather was a Covenanter, and his religious and political beliefs strongly influenced family memory. Eliza Dunlop's own barrister father, Solomon Hamilton, had a library of Republican writing, including by Enlightenment philosophers. Both families then were linked to movements committed to political independence and religious tolerance, and these ideologies underpinned Dunlop's verse. Broader diasporic geographies beyond Ireland and Australia were often conjoined in Dunlop's elegies. Duncan Wu shows how Dunlop's poem Morning on Rostra of a Mountain draws on a wide-ranging tableau of revolutionary sites, from the Ulster uprisings of 1798 to Calcutta's Ganges, where a graveyard gloom engaged the poet's memories. In this poem's dreamlike itineraries, India and the Cape Colony map sites of colonial unrest and rebellion, from the Black Hole of Calcutta to Robben Island off Cape Town. Wu concludes that these visions provide a kind of prelapsarian account of landscapes in which bloodshed and suffering happens just off screen. Readers would have brought their knowledge of these contexts to a poem that Wu claims is audacious, daring, and incendiary, in its coded allusions through imagery to a revolutionary anti-imperial history that could not be directly recorded. But even Dunlop's most personal elegies were also politically coded. When her husband David died in Australia in 1863, Eliza published The Two Graves in Sydney's The Empire, By August of the same year, the poem was published in their Irish hometown paper, the Coleraine Chronicle. She linked David's death to that of his father, Captain William Dunlop, who was hanged as a rebel in the Irish uprising and buried in unconsecrated ground. Dunlop's The Two Graves, you see a section of it here, recalls what she calls the Requiem of Red 98, emphasising the fierce reign of terror in Ireland and the bloody history of revolution. The two men are characterised as patriots, separated by distance, but joined in death. Tombs parted as wide as the span of a sphere, yet father and son have had widowhood's tear. Predestined in life to bend under the rod, through much tribulation they pass to their God, and stars' rays fall bright on the homes of their rest, from the cross of the south and the lyre of the west. As in the previous poem, The Irish Volunteers, Dunlop used the metaphor of distinctive southern constellations, here the Southern Cross, to link diasporic experience and advocate for progressive Australian politics. Even in more personal poems, such as Memorialis, her second individual tribute to David after his death, Dunlop recounted the political history of the Dunlop family in Ulster, pulling against the ostensibly private affective register of elegy. Now, Eliza Hamilton Dunlop's upbringing within a well-educated milieu who were directly involved in various kinds of culture productions means that we can read her own writing alongside that of other family members and her literary contemporaries to build a fuller picture that links these archival sources to the public record and to literary history. It has required much archival detective work. From Ireland and New South Wales, both official and personal, signed and anonymous papers are dispersed across a wide range of dated and undated systems that reveal both family enthusiasms and institutional library structures. And these are the sources through which we can trace the lives, thoughts and writing of Eliza Hamilton Dunlop. Women writers often struggle to have their literary achievements noted, even though their publications increased across the 18th and 19th century. And I think that example of Duffy losing the name, the initials of that initial poem is a really lovely instance of what could happen. And like many women, the archives are not well ordered or not entirely expected. In one box full of company account records, of the family into which Dunlop's daughter married, there's this entire volume of juvenile poetry and translations, lightly anonymised, but clearly written by the young Eliza in Ireland between 1808 and 1813, and illustrated by her watercolours. Each poem is carefully transcribed in an exquisitely clear hand, and with its date and precise location of composition noted, which has been the main way in which I've been able to map Dunlop's young thoughts and passions, and there were plenty of passions. These juvenile poems, together with fragments of a journal that was partially transcribed by a family historian in the 1960s from family sources, provide insights into Dunlop's childhood, yet they raise as many questions as they resolve. In many ways, Eliza had been a child of empire in Northern Ireland, a life that was both privileged and precarious. The youngest child and only daughter of Solomon Hamilton and Martha Costley, about whom very little can be learned, the mother, Eliza was brought up by her paternal grandmother, Mary Hamilton, née Spear. The Hamiltons were, of course, a large and well-connected Anglo-Irish family. Some branches moved to the Ulster plantations from Scotland in the 17th century. Solomon Hamilton, Eliza's father, was intellectually curious, ambitious and restless. He was admitted to the King's Inn Society in the 1770s, but by 1781 he applied for admission to the Calcutta Bar and launched a legal career there representing opulent native clients and British subjects in Bengal. That description is from a description by his fellow attorney, William Hickey, who wrote a diary. And Solomon is described by Hickey as a devilish, shrewd, clever fellow, fit for the practice of the villainous profession he belongs to, and fully competent to encounter all the chicanery and dirty tricks of his scoundrel brother attorneys. I think he's probably right. Legal earnings presumably underpinned Hamilton's acquisition of significant Northern Irish land holdings and tenements around Carlingford and Ross River in the 1790s, including Fort Hamilton, later the site of Ballydedmond Castle. Solomon's eldest sons, Augustus and George, were born nearly 10 years after Solomon and Martha's marriage, and Eliza Matilda Harding Hamilton was born in 1796. We can only presume that Martha died soon after Eliza's birth. Now, Dunlop grew up in these idyllic landscapes around Carlingford Bay, which is one of the next stops on my little tour here. She describes this as sublime scenery, where the broad arm of ocean is stretched between the wildly picturesque hills of Killowen and Carlingford. Her love of local history and the natural environment is evident in her juvenile poems and watercolours, and she had a wide-ranging self-education, having been given free access to her father's library. Now, Solomon's library was perhaps the way that Eliza best knew her father, and what we know of its contents provides a mapping of her literary and philosophical influences. She describes herself as having an early spirit of research, noting that by 12, she had already read the voyage accounts of Captain Cook, William Anson, and La Perouse, among astronomy, geography, and general interest volumes, novels, and poetry. Significantly, Solomon's library also contained many major Republican and philosophical texts, including Mary Wollstonecraft, Thomas Paine, and Voltaire. The family library also held a copy of David Collins' An Account of the English Colony in New South Wales, which may have influenced Eliza's later choice of immigration to Australia. Philosophical thought and literary study was central to Eliza's unconventional childhood. Maria Edgeworth visited Fort Hamilton in 1807, and it's highly likely that Eliza would have met the writer and advocate for women's education. So Dunlop was brought up as an active cultural participant in a notable, if occasionally notorious, family in a period where literature and poetry were important forms of social commentary through which to explore religious, cultural, and political ideas. The young Eliza wrote what she called original pieces prolifically from at least 1810, at the time of 14. Her topics included standard pieces on virtues and vices, responses to her local environment, and her emotional attachments to her family, and also love poems. I'll get into some of these later, they're great. And long narrative poems influenced by history and mythology, mostly pseudonymously or under, history and mythology, also focused on nearby castles. Some early poems were published in local Irish magazines, mostly pseudonymously or under obscure initials. She was very close to her cousin William Hamilton Maxwell, who some of you may know, whose first anonymously published novel O'Hara, or 1798, addressed the 1798 uprising, title can tell, and published in 1825. He later became a prolific writer of fairly conservative military-themed fiction and non-fiction based on his experience of the Napoleonic War. The cousins shared a regular correspondence across their life and at times collaborated. On hearing of his death, she eulogized him as the gifted one, inspired with heaven's effulgent flame. Now, the juvenile poetry also reveals some of the difficulties of Dunlop's youth. The poems assigned Evelina or Evelina Matilda or Eliza Matilda. Like other 14-year-olds, and I have one at the moment, Eliza was likely experimenting with her persona, but her choice of nom de plume also reflects, I think, the eponymous heroine of Fanny Burney's popular novel Evelina, published in 1778. Burney's Evelina is a beautiful and virtuous orphan cast adrift on the ferocious marriage market of London. Though motherless, though worse than fatherless, bereft from infancy of the two first and greatest blessings of life, she considers herself blessed by great fortune to have a beloved and dependable guardian. Like Burney's Evelina, Eliza had no reliable parental presence, and worse, her guardianship was variable. She writes with great affection of her grandmother, Mary Hamilton, These early years she described as ones of perfect happiness. I was loved, my genius was extolled, and I was taught to expect a father's return who would love me too, visionary expectations. But by 1807 or 8, Eliza's grandmother died, and from Calcutta, her father sold her beloved home, Fort Hamilton, to Alexander Stewart, who with his wife Sarah assumed some form of guardianship. Eliza struggled to access the funds promised to her. Unbeknown to her, Solomon Hamilton's life in Calcutta was probably focused on his two new daughters, Charlotte and Mary, and their Indian mother, Maria. Dunlop's brothers were also in India. Her cousin William had entered Trinity College, Dublin. Dunlop probably felt utterly bereft. Her 1810 poem, The Tear, laments a bosom fraught with pain when peace has fled with all her train. But by 1810, Dunlop had also met James Sylvius Law, an astronomer and poet. It's possible he was her tutor. She was only 14. She was precociously intelligent and believed to be a local beauty. Many years later in New South Wales, an Irish acquaintance still remembered the beauty and abundance of your hair. The two, James Sylvius Law and Eliza, exchanged teasing and romantic poetic epistles. She declared him her muse and dramatically declared, "'Twas a spark of thy poetic fire, first illumed this bosom and taught it to heave." It's pretty racy out there in Carlingford Bay, lots of heaving bosoms. Law and Eliza shared many interests. He moved in intellectual circles, read widely and published poetry. By 1812, it appears they had married, although family records suggest her father was unhappy with the match and probably hadn't approved it. The marriage faltered early, but produced two children, James, who I can't find any evidence of beyond his existence, and Mary Sophia Georgina, born in 1816. James Sylvius Law was pretty unreliable. He first suggested going to India, which Solomon Hamilton discouraged, and by 1814 and 15, Solomon wrote back to Ireland expressing serious concern for Eliza and her first child, given her unprotected state. It's difficult to trace James Sylvius Law's movements, but in 1816 he was in New York, also writing poetry. The marriage had obviously failed by then, and in 1820 Eliza took a journey to India that had been arranged by her father, leaving her young daughter Georgina with family. But on arrival in Calcutta, she learnt that her father had died during her voyage and that her brothers refused to acknowledge their father's Indian family. Her inheritance from Solomon Hamilton's estate was augmented with some funds from her brothers, and importantly, it enabled her to secure her independence. Although the details of her settlement with Law remain obscure, please insert suggestions here, 2 years after her return from India, Dunlop was able to remarry to David Dunlop in 1823 in Port Patrick, Scotland, where marriage laws were, of course, more favourable to deserted women than in either England or Ireland. Now, Eliza and David's marriage, too, was fuelled by politics and ideas. They'd been friends before her trip to India. David was a bookbinder and heavily involved in Ulster politics. David and Eliza established their reign, a site of intense political activity. David was active in the early 19th century affairs of the Honourable the Irish Society, including providing education across sectarian divides. He was also involved in post-union reforms promoted by Ulster leaders that called for an end to absentee landlords, and is named on this petition that went from Coleraine to London. Eliza's family connections contributed to this campaign, and she personally took representations to England. Members of the Irish Society stood against the sitting member, and after considerable political chicanery, the London alderman William Taylor Copeland was elected. And amongst all this politics, Eliza and David Dunlop had 5 children between 1823 and 29. Dunlop's daughter from her first marriage, Georgina, became part of a large family. Dunlop was ambitious for David, using her family's extensive contacts to try and secure him a position in London. Yet despite determined advocacy, this did not come to fruition, perhaps because he had also made powerful enemies during the Coleraine period. So in 1837, the family emigrated to Sydney. Copeland, by then MP for Stoke, wrote the Dunlops a letter of introduction that would have been well received by Sir George Gipps, the new governor. Copeland acknowledged Eliza's determined pursuit of stability for her large family. He wrote in a letter, "In a pecuniary point of view, 20 guineas towards your passage and a tot of crocks are at your service if you decide to go. Be not offended at my blunt mode of dealing with this matter." The tot of crocks came from Copeland's ownership of Spode pottery, and the china was passed down through the Australian family as a token of their Anglo-Irish heritage. Dunlop's cousin William, the writer and scoundrel in a number of other ways, counselled her, "Courage and a few years will see you prosperous and happy. You must accommodate yourself to wanted comforts, and forgetting that Solomon Hamilton's child was entitled by descent to an easier fate, you must struggle to build up new fortunes in a new land." Although the colonial political environment proved to be as challenging as Northern Ireland in some respects, as you've seen, it also provided much material for the remainder of Dunlop's writing life. Now, as I've mentioned, like many female writers, Dunlop's authorship was at times elided and her gender mistaken. So too, some of Dunlop's important writings in unpublished sources, despite her consistent publication in the Australian colonial press. And you'll have seen the way in which I'm trying to move around the complexities of recreating this kind of literary life, needing to move beyond a traditional literary history that focuses on an individual's assumed desire for publication and their success or otherwise in achieving it. Many of these stories are stories of failed or missed publications. But my aim in doing so is to create a rich account that both reconstructs a writing woman's life by analysing its archival traces and subjecting it to analysis. And it requires reading across unpublished and published material, letters, journals and correspondence, and histories and family biographies. Reading relationally is central because it's often through the male-dominated public record that we can reconstruct how women such as Dunlop wrote and lived in the margins of mainstream literary culture. Connecting Dunlop's literary and family history back to Northern Ireland reveals how she used its sentimental poetic discourse popular with women publishing at the time. Manu Samruti Chanda reminds us that a group he calls the Brown Romantics mobilised poetry to do much the same kind of discursive and political work in the long 19th century. Arguably, Dunlop was predisposed to seek out Indigenous culture and language in Australia, given her Irish background and acute awareness of sectarian divisions and their destructive tendencies through her early political interests and second marriage into an Ulster Presbyterian family. The bloody history of revolution and its suppression in Ireland remained potent metaphors throughout Dunlop's writing career. She joins a cadre of poets imagining a liberal form of colonialism who also found themselves deeply implicated in its contradictions and complicities. Thank you.
Anna, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. It was fascinating paper. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So obviously we've got an audience in the room and we've got an audience online. So if anyone online wants to ask a question, you just need to raise your hand digitally. You see the little hand icon on your screen, and then I'll ask you just to unmute yourself and ask a question. So we might just start with the room, perhaps. Anyone would like to just kick off? Any questions? Yeah.
Thanks very much. I was interested in the titling songs of an exile. I wonder if you might elaborate a little bit on what's significant about the form of the song. I knew that where is edited a fraction of Irish song, so perhaps there's something significant there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and it's something that I had sort of noted myself, but not to spend a lot of time thinking about. And then I commissioned a music historian to have a look at it, because a number of the poems you might have seen, I'm not sure the ones that I showed you, might suggest a particular song that it was set to. So it was part of the importation, the global kind of movement of Irish and English songs around with, the settler diaspora as they moved. So often they were songs, and the fantastic music historian Graham Skinner has traced almost all of the songs that she would have been working with, and has even done some reconstructions of them. So I think particularly with the Songs of an Exile series, all of them were imagined as connected to particular song types. And sometimes she acknowledges which ones they were. And of course, that also made them very accessible to others in Australia as well, because even though she was writing new content, new lyrics for them, the form of the songs would have been very familiar. So again, it's that really interesting ways in which these poets were importing traditional structures, both poetic structures, but also song structures, but kind of reimagining them in new colonial settings.
Resonances of those songs, or do they work sometimes maybe?
Some did and some, yeah, I think that some did and some didn't. And so sometimes it's just about the meter or the kind of the poetic usefulness. Sometimes there are some connections, but it's not sort of, it's not even like, we can't kind of work out an exact, kind of mode of operation. And we haven't been able to trace all of them, but pretty much all of them. Some of her other poems, I mean, I've mostly been talking about the Songs of Exile and the poems that I call Elegies today. Some of the others didn't have songs attached to them, so it was one of her methods, but not the only one that she used. But yes, I'd be fascinated, because I think those, particularly Dibdin's Irish, it's Dibdin's Irish melodies, isn't it? And Moore's, yeah, yes, yeah, were often transported, yeah.
That's great. We enjoyed it. Thank you. Can I just think about newspapers and newspaper poetry? We had a kind of amateurish delve into Trove and Philip a little bit in a slightly later period. I mean, some of the papers, Australian papers that she's sending poems to, I mean, is there a sense that she's sending them to particular titles? And then what happens when these poems are taken up by other people in other places, and that kind of cut and paste journalism takes off, where different editors in different places give them a life of their own? So the kind of poems are moving beyond her authorial control of various points. So just great to hear you elaborate a little bit on where you think she's actually, targeting material, and at what points the material will then become something outside of her own jurisdiction.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So, I mean, I suppose just the first thing I'd want to say is that there was no Australian free press until about 1824. And then there was a proliferation of a free press. Up until then, there was a lot of army rule, and basically the Gazette was the only form of print culture. And who could become an editor of a newspaper, as newspapers then proliferated from the mid-1820s onwards, was a site of great contestation. They were very politically divided, and very much, bound to particular party interests. And so one of the great controversies was that George Howe, who was the first printer and actually printed the Government Gazette, was an emancipist. And so the newspapers, in the colonial newspapers between the 20s and 60s, were a really hotbed, and there were some which continued and some which continue today, like the Australian newspaper, but there would also be ones that kind of started and folded. So what I think happened, and you can see just the start of it here in this 2-year period, is that she targeted particular newspapers. Probably she had connections with particular editors for a period of time, but then circumstances mitigated against that. And what's interesting here, it's good actually that I left the stories of the Exile there. You can see how she's placed the stories in a different newspaper to where she's placed the poetry. The Australian newspaper had a regular poetry section, and it was page 3. And so if you wanted to enter the poetic conversation, it was probably the best place to get a poem published. And there was particularly with Dunlop's poems, we see just an immense debate around the poems. People would write in response to them. So particularly the Aboriginal Mother poem, not even so much on its first publication, but it was republished in 1842 as a piece of sheet music. So another connection back to the music and song. And there's an interesting story there I can tell you at some stage, that people would write to the newspapers commenting on the poetry, mostly critiquing it, being very forthright. And so she stopped publishing in the Australian after about 1842 because I think she found the editors were kind of editorializing against her. So she would also write in and say, you mentioned my new publication, but you didn't even quote it. How can you do that? And then they'd say, oh, well, the editors would say, well, look, here's your letter, but we didn't actually think it was very good, so we didn't write it. So she became so controversial between 1838 and 1842 that I think she would then have found individual editors who wanted to support her. And so then she moved through different publishers. The Empire was one she published in a lot in the 1840s. And those newspapers sort of opened and closed as well. So it was also probably circumstance and contingency. So, but it is quite fascinating. You can see her career at different times, placing material with one editor and then redoing, developing new alliances later on. There are some gaps, but she published until 7 years before her death, at about 80, so 84.
Sophie.
Thank you very much for that. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the social circle in Australia, because obviously later on you've got melding of Chartists are there, 1848ers are there, and they're all kind of working together and influencing each other in a way that I think traditionally has just been seen as like Irish revolution, like Eureka and Vinegar Hill thing.
Yeah.
And that's just been seen as Irish revolutionariness instead of a wider radicalism. So I was just wondering, is Eliza Hamilton Dunlop working within this wider kind of Ulster maybe, but revolutionary circle, or is she kind of a lone voice in her social circle?
Yeah, they know people when they arrive, and then of course other immigrants come through. And so that comment about her luscious hair as a teenager came from this woman who's just suddenly turned up and recognized her name and wrote to her saying, "Are you the Eliza?" And of course, given her complicated marital history, you can imagine that wasn't a letter that you would receive entirely comfortably, because it also meant that this person remembered not only your hair, but perhaps some of the scandal that had surrounded you. So, so there's some really interesting ways in which, because immigration just, continues throughout all that period, that she must have come into contact with new, familiar and unfamiliar other Irish immigrants at different times. To go to your question, I think you're right. And I think one of the things that's happened, I think you're absolutely right about saying that in Australian history, Irishness has just come to be a singular thing. And there's now, work that Ronan MacDonald and other people are doing, trying to better understand. And I've had to really better understand exactly where she came from, what the consequences of her references are, because even some of the early work on Dunlop has made some pretty, it's made errors, really. They just get things wrong. They make assumptions about her. I mean, including whether she's Catholic or Protestant, for example, because it's a longer story. But they know very important people. So they know a guy called Sir John Jameson, who also has a little bit of a scandalous personal history, but is very influential in the colonial government of the time. And he really brings them into his social circle and seems to be supporting the Dunlop family in the early days. He lends them his house at Emu Plains, and they live there for a little while until they get a proper establishment. But then he's a difficult figure. He's very involved in politics and plays them very hard. And then David Dunlop ends up on the wrong side of sort of settler interests. And they discover that John Jameson's been kind of backgrounding him as well after the first year. They also know Plunkett, the Plunkett family, and they're really important because it's actually Herbert Plunkett who's the judge that sits and persists with the support of Sir George Gipps about the second trial of the Mile Creek massacres, and he was a leading Catholic in Sydney at a time in which, of course, Catholicism was seen to be associated with lower class convictism, disrepute, and so you can sort of see this elite circle of Irish connections, and that certainly smooths their entry into colonial Australian society. But then I think when Dunlop publishes The Aboriginal Mother and a few other poems on Aboriginal themes, I don't know how socially acceptable they remained. And so because of both her publishing that poem and David Dunlop having a big fight with the kind of elite at his first posting as police magistrate, they get sent up country to a place called Wollongby, which is sort of in from Newcastle on the east coast, as punishment, I think, for being a little bit too pushy and political. Hilariously, of course, that's right on the northern or near the northern frontier. So the Mile Creek massacre, one of the things that happens in Wollongby, which is this tiny little town, it's where 3 different Indigenous groups kind of crossed over in terms of spiritual and landscape and a kind of landscape of internal migration. So Eliza spends her time there learning Indigenous languages, and fighting even more about the violence she starts to hear about from the Indigenous women in particular who she's talking to. And the violence of the frontier is just, 100 kilometres or so away. And Wollongby also, what should we say? There was one non-convict perpetrator of the massacre who should have been prosecuted but fled police arrest, and that community actually sheltered him for the next 30 years. So again, politically, they were sent to this kind of obscure little country sort of posting, but in fact it was politically very hot, both in terms of Indigenous politics and settler politics of violence. So, Oh, sorry, but just the last thing, can I say, I think class is a really important thing here as well. That's sort of perhaps my answering your question more directly, is that I think the sense that the Chartists and the kind of Vinegar Hill uprising and all of that kind of Eureka stuff is kind of a lower sort of strata of society.
Yeah, although you've got people like Peter Walton.
Exactly. That's right. And that's also the interesting thing that's happening in Australia, in the Australian colonies, of course, is that there's a capacity for this kind of mobility, social mobility, even though it's kind of hard fought for as well. Thank you.
I wanted to go back to the poem or song, actually, because it's explicitly set to a 1780 music, the Irish Volunteers. So I was was there something more to be said about that? Because did you say that her father had died in 1798? Was it her father's family member had died in 1798?
David Dunlop's father died in 1798. Yeah. He was hanged.
So my question is, did she write about 1798? Is there anything of 1798?
Yes.
But this is why because this seems very curious. It's incredibly specific, because it'd be interesting to know what your colleague who's working with you on the music. Because I would think that 1780, it was actually completely by chance. I was looking at this last week. There's Volunteers Reel, which is published with the music in, I'm pretty certain, 1780 in Dublin. So that's probably that. It's a beautiful, it's a very expensive book. It's a big kind of book. So it's not like the Foggy Dew or presumably Peggy Barn. Foggy Dew, very well known there. Peggy. So it's not like those ballad tunes that, Justin was saying, very familiar and lots of people know. Don't think the Volunteers Real, but maybe others know. Don't actually think the Volunteers Real. Perhaps maybe became really very popularly.
Well, I mean, if you look at the kind of public culture of Belfast radicalism in the 1830s, 1840s, it's all about the volunteers. They're using volunteers to talk about 1798. There's a lot of music, there's a lot of recycling of volunteer music in the public world of Belfast radicalism, political meetings, etc.
So she's possibly taken that with her from
Possibly.
what time? When did she leave for Australia?
1837.
1837.
So the timing would have been right for that. And she does say here the music composed by a professor in Dublin in 1780.
Yeah.
So that connects to exactly what you're saying there. Yes. So she
It's very precise. That seems to me it's an allusion to a very particular publication in 1780, and therefore there's actually an antiquarian interest.
yes.
And so it's that conflation of like the popular and the semi-antiquarian. But yeah, maybe through the 1830s and 40s, that's as you're saying, Peter, that's very current. It's not an unusual kind of combination in that way.
You also tend to get Britain's Parliament and the Irish volunteers brought up in Australia quite a lot because it's seen as kind of a federalist approach, so it's less contentious
Than
than
1780.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting too that this one's, I mean, they say this is the editorial comment here from the Australasian Chronicle. We have no doubt that it will be well received and meet with such encouragement will be satisfactory to every friend of old Erin. So there's also a sense that there's a readership for this, which connects with your point, which is really interesting. So so this is the only poem she talks about 1780. It's republished in a couple of different locations, and she often has little kind of paratextual notes. And they was there in other places. 1798, she really talks about that when she's talking about when David dies and she's connecting him back to his father who was killed in what she calls Red 98. So that I've got it over here. No, I haven't. Sorry, put a different stanza here. On her bold northern coast where the Isle of West owns Eliza, shed a tear for the name as you look to the date and let sighs ring the requiem of Red 98. So she's referring there to her husband, David's father's hanging as part of the revolution.
Could I ask Anna, is there anything in her writing related to anti-slavery? And the reason I ask that is that Ulster Presbyterian radicalism in the 1830s is very, I mean, that's front and centre of the anti-slavery movement. Belfast Anti-Slavery Society is extremely well supported. It has a lot of female participation in it. And I've come across other cases of people who are involved in the anti-slavery movement who also take an interest in the rights of Aboriginal people in Australia.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is there a potential connection there? But obviously, for you to pick that up, will need to be reflected.
Yeah.
Writing.
It's a really interesting question, Peter. Look, she doesn't, and you're right that that's unusual. Because there was such a movement across, the abolitionists and other parts of my work. I do a lot of work with the Protestant evangelical movement and the Aboriginal Protection Society and the ways in which they absolutely sort of saw the end of or the success of the the abolitionist movement as providing the tools really to worry about Aboriginal peoples of the British settlements, which is that 1837 famous Select Committee, of course. She doesn't write about slavery. Duncan Wu's reading of her poem Morning on Rostrevor Mountain does connect, which I think is, I mean, I want to be persuaded by it, but I think it might be a little bit of a stretch, but that's okay. But he connects some of her references to the Cape Colony and to particular resistance leaders that were incarcerated there, as well as to things around the Irish, the Black Hole of Calcutta. So those other kinds of locations are picked up. And the Aboriginal mother poem, there's a critic called John O'Leary who did his PhD around sort of colonial poetry of this period, and he really reads the Aboriginal mother as part of those crying mother poems. And there are really similarities in terms of that sentimental verse, and they were often about slave women who had their children removed. And that so there's a really clear, and there were Native American versions of those poems as well. It was a very mobile kind of form of writing, not always by women, but mostly about women and about their suffering under slavery and other forms of colonialism. But it is interesting that she doesn't really write specifically about slavery. She's very interested in India because of that family connection. And so that comes into a few poems, not as many as, I haven't found as many of those as I would like to. She did apparently published a poem in Calcutta in the particular journal, which might have been dedicated to her half sister while she was there. So, but slavery itself, not so much. And that's interesting.
Sophia,
No, it's last one, just had to questions. It was just what you were saying about the marriage. I went to a really interesting paper by a PhD student here. I can give you details later, but she was talking about bigamy in Ulster. And she said, obviously, it was a bit later on, but she was saying that that it is primarily perpetrated by men, but of the women arrested for it in the whole of Ireland, there's a very high proportion of them being in Ulster, and switching across religious traditions was often kind of accepted, and it was kind of just part and parcel of life.
Yeah.
People, it was socially acceptable.
Mm.
So I don't know if she was a bigamist, but it wouldn't have been that unusual.
She wouldn't have been the only one. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be in Ulster. It seems to be more acceptable.
That's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, I can't find any, I actually can't find any evidence of her first marriage. And so I suppose that's the other question is, were they actually ever married? Her father assumes that they were, but he also knows that he didn't approve it. And it's interesting that the first child, I can't find any reference to his birth either. So that also makes you wonder whether or not. So yes, I mean, my first assumption was that she probably was a bigamist. But I mean, it is also desertion. She could have, and given that she married into a family that had very strong church connections, yeah, there might have been a way in which she could demonstrate desertion in Scotland, because it had probably been quite a period of time by then. And of course, by then she was financially independent as well, because she got the inheritance. So, you know, it's a puzzle, and I have to be a bit careful when I talk to the family about it, because they say things like, "Oh, she must have got a divorce." Maybe, maybe not. But yeah, that's very interesting. Then also, do you think it was? I mean, what about class? Because when I've read about those kind of desertions and bigamy, it does seem to me that's a more kind of lower class spectrum of women who, you know, are just, and men just trying their best to kind of reinvent themselves constantly. She was quite high profile to be.
I'm not sure. There's a really good book on Irish marriage, which is very in depth and also very.
Yeah, I think I got to that, but I'll make sure I did. Yeah, I did a lot of reading there.
There's also a very good book on Irish divorce by our colleague Dan Urquhart. When to divorce in the early 1820s, very expensive, very public, and would require a parliamentary procedure.
Well, that's right.
So if you find not come across it,
yeah,
it's unlikely that she was divorced.
Yeah, even if she'd popped across to Scotland.
Well, you can't get divorced in Scotland. I think that's you can marry in Scotland.
Yeah, that's where she remarried. Yeah,
but if she's married under Irish laws, that would require parliamentary. Yeah.
But also then you kind of like obviously being high profile would be harder, but different religious traditions have different definitions of what counts as a marriage.
Yes.
If you're not legally writing it down. So is there a priest there? Is there like have you all of this? So it might not be really.
Well, no, and the thing that I also think is that, and I haven't really been able to properly trace him, but James Silvius Law, I think, also comes from a pretty good family. And there are laws of his sort of rough generation who end up becoming bishops. So I think it might have been in everybody's interests for the marriage to go away.
quickly about Irish, because one of the poems or songs has sort of phonetic Irish titles. And jotted down that slam. And obviously there was something you quoted was like, a cree, Grand Cree. And so are they just tags, or is it particularly because you did say she was interested in Aboriginal language and learned?
Yeah. So my general sense is that she used Aboriginal languages in the same ways that she used Irish in her poetry. So she certainly in a number of the juvenile poetry poems, but also kind of throughout her career, she would use terms. And we, Elizabeth Webby, who did a new critical edition of this much larger body of Dunlop's poetry, and it's a proper critical edition, so we checked the translations of the terms, and she seems to have known what she was doing. And yeah, that's absolutely my hunch, is that she was, even though she was obviously from a very privileged family, Irish would have been something she heard around, but wouldn't have been part of her kind of formal language learning. She had an ear for language, and that's why she's actually a really interesting collector of Indigenous languages in Australia, because she hears things very precisely. And she already knows that English is not a lingua franca, and she knows that you need different orthographies, and she knows that speakers will correct both how you say it, but also how you write it. And so there's I haven't talked about this at all, but these word lists that she constructed are really some of the early and really significant collections of languages in sort of northern New South Wales. And interestingly, at the same time, there were about 300 plus Indigenous languages pre-colonisation. But it took settlers a long time to realise that was the case. And so they started to collect words, and then they thought they could use the same language at, Swan River over in Western Australia as at Botany Bay, as at Cape York Colony. And so Cape York Peninsula. So they took them a long time, and then they kept trying to, and it's part of that amazing philological inquiry during the long 18th, 19th century, in which they're trying to map languages in families. And so even within the Australian Indigenous languages, they keep trying to lump them together. But Dunlop, because she's a poet, like she's got a table from 1838, and she's like, these are the 7 dialects of this region, and here are the 5 words that I'm mapping in those 7 dialects. And I've done this by going out and talking to Mr. What's his name, who's been learning the Aboriginal languages, and some Indigenous men were visiting. There's a poem that she published in Indigenous language, the first poem that was ever published in Indigenous language, that was told to her by a particular man, and then she transliterates it into an English language version, and she translates some of the terms in Indigenous language and publishes all of those as a kind of composite poem in the Australian. So yeah, I think the exposure to Irish, the sense, that kind of slightly, romantic, exotic kind of thing that you pepper your poetry with exotic phrases and languages to make it part of that, love of the exotic and engagement with other cultures. But then also that training meant that she was then an extraordinary collector of Indigenous languages.
Yeah,
just in terms of people that went to Australia from this island, both as new free settlers or convicts, was she a trailblazer in writing about the themes that she did write about, or is there many other people producing songs and poems that around the same themes?
There's a lot of bad poetry published, an awful lot of bad poetry. So, verse was a kind of a means of communicating, writing yourself, establishing a name for yourself. So there was a lot of poetry written, and including by Irish immigrants, particularly free folks. Hers is really unusual in its kind of, even you can see with that Songs of an Exile series, like she's imagining an oeuvre of work rather than just a random poem about particular things. And that's why, the Book of Juvenile Poetry, that's obviously not the first versions of those poems. She's imagined those as a publication and put them together in a journal. So I think she's really different in that sense to just the everyday.
Yes, the way people say it's usually say the rich write history and usually try to sanitize, what actually happened. But if you want to know what actually happened, to the poor and listen to the songs that they wrote, because I know that say the Irish I'm very interested in the Irish colonial songs from America because it's quite good and it's particularly interesting. Of fighting their experiences on the railways and then saying about the people that were conscripted into the Union Army as the Federal Army and then the ones that deserted and joined the Mexican forces and then went on down. And it's voluminous. Like the stories that they write about, it's quite horrific.
Yeah.
And it really, really tells you that their experience is like the whole Irish in America experience is being quite sanitized. The Irish have been doing great and they beat the system and now, they can pray down. Fifth Avenue on St. Patrick's Day, but actually go back to the songs from when they were in the Union. It's quite horrific. And just even say the Irish experience with, say, befriending some of the indigenous tribes over there. I just wonder, I never really thought about it from an Australian point of view. This is quite, I opening really is quite interesting to get involved in. But was there any experience of kind of, say, the Irish befriending, say, the Aboriginals and almost kind of teaming up with them and then like trying to write songs and poems around that experience? That makes sense.
There's a sentimental narrative around that, and it's certainly the case that not so much about writing songs. It really doesn't happen by very many people at all, because really, and even, I mean, you can even see the Aboriginal mother as part of this. There's a sense that the Aboriginal people are just going to die away, so why bother with recording their histories, and really those kind of cross-cultural relationships which did happen were not to be talked about. Those were fairly scandalous, not scandalous, I mean, every day, but they were not sanctified usually. I mean, they were not usual marriages, and class comes into that a huge amount. But those songs certainly did come across, and I think probably the Irish component of the convict population was probably less literate than the Protestant component. And the paper I gave in Dublin was actually about Norfolk Island, which is one of the sites of secondary punishment, sort of off the coast of Australia, a tiny little dot in the Pacific. But there was a really interesting Scottish penal reformer, Alexander McConaughey, who went there, and he brought books and music, including the Dibdin and more songbooks, to help the convicts there who were secondary convicts, so they'd reoffended when they'd got to the Australian colonies, and he wanted to use those songs to help them feel fonder towards the motherland, because he'd heard them express dislike of the country that had transported them fancy, and he saw songs as a way of reattaching their sentiments to the homeland and seeing themselves as English and Irishmen in exile rather than as kind of outcast convicts. So you're absolutely right that those songs carried both kind of conservative and radical ideas, as they moved around, and were a form of kind of intellectual currency, I suppose. And particularly
accessible. They're accessible to find. Like if I wanted to try and find something.
Yeah, I don't know where you'd look in terms of, I mean, because whether or not they were published or not, that's the other thing, whether they just existed in an oral tradition. So yeah, it's an interesting question. Enjoying that songs.
If I could just go back to the Irish language question, Sean will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the area around Carlingford and the Cooley Peninsula is predominantly Irish speaking when she's growing up there.
So maybe it was.
So this would presumably she would have been in daily contact with Irish speakers.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising if she's picking up.
That's interesting.
Bits.
That's right, like through the study, very densely settled from the Middle Ages. Don't get the same continuity elsewhere. But that little bit of Irish, the lat, what was the last word? Slow. Doesn't actually make any sense as far as I can see.
Does it not? Okay.
Well, Dia is God. Lat is with you. Slow is state. God is towards or to. It's a preposition. So,
You get that a lot though in tune titles that are transliterated, I mean, the transliterations, so.
Just kind of pidgin Irish then.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting about that location though. Mm.
It was interesting whether it's an oral source or a printed source. It's not impossible for it to be printed because there's plenty of printed tags of that kind. I mean, it's interesting in the recent bibliography of Irish language printing, the Clonista, they did include some texts where there's just a little, they haven't done that exhaustively because that would be a huge task, but they have sometimes included English language material that just uses some of these kind of tags. And I think, yeah, these tags are probably circulated by English speakers who are not fluent in Irish.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting question because that's going in two different directions, isn't it? On the one hand, she's growing up in Carlingford, the oral tradition of that, that area, across the border as it is now in 20th century. Very, very strong traditions of Irish song in Irish language in particular. So she may well be familiar from that, and yet, I think the Irish Volunteer, the music of that, because, well, again, it would be interesting. I don't know, because I'm really not an 1830s and 1840s person, but it'd be interesting to know if that's still kind of a tune that's known, rather than one that's printed. Because I get the sense, and certainly in the last 2 decades of the 18th century, it's a very print culture rather than an oral.
Isn't there a recent anthology of Irish ones songs from the Good Listen that Porgy and the Hurricane?
Yes, yeah.
That sounds interesting.
You're not getting the volunteer meal though in that. No, that.
Great. We haven't got any questions from online, but lots of kind of positive comments about a fascinating presentation, and thank you for speaking to us this afternoon. It has been wonderful, and I thank you so much for coming and talking to us today about Eliza Hamilton Dunlop. It is a really interesting subject, and so the kind of length of time that we've had discussing it is an indication of how much interest there is here.
It's lovely.
And
Thank you for all your suggestions. I really appreciate it.
Hopefully we can carry on conversations
Yeah.
going forward as well. So we'll kind of wind up there for today, and maybe just thank Anna in the normal fashion for. And thank you for joining us online, folks. So we haven't got a seminar next week, but in 2 weeks' time, we have Michelle McGough-McCann, former PhD student here in Queens, recently published a book on the Irish coroner in the 19th century. And she'll be talking to us about death investigating during the Great Irish Famine, the role of the coroner and the inquest. So you're very welcome to join us in person or online in 2 weeks' time on the 2nd of October.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
In unexpected ways. I have a